Imagine a silence so absolute that you could hear the heartbeat of a thousand-year-old institution. Behind the heavy gilded doors of Kensington Palace, a meeting has just ended, a gathering that was never meant to appear on any official calendar. There were no cameras, no press releases, only a room full of the world's most composed individuals who suddenly found themselves unable to speak above a panicked whisper. When Princess Catherine finally stepped out of that oak paneled room, her signature radiant smile was gone. She looked visibly shaken, her hands trembling as they gripped a set of files that weren't about the future of the crown, but about a ghost the palace had spent 30 years trying to bury. Her name was Diana, and her secrets are no longer sealed. The British monarchy is a machine designed for one thing: survival through silence. For centuries, the mantra of never complain, never explain has been the iron shield protecting the House of Windsor. But on a Tuesday afternoon that began like any other, that shield did more than just crack, it shattered. The atmosphere inside the private corridors of Kensington Palace shifted from cold professionalism to an almost electric state of dread. Senior palace aides, men and women who have witnessed wars, scandals, and transitions of power without blinking, were seen hovering in small groups, their faces pale. Something had been found, something that was supposed to stay lost. Reports indicate that Princess Catherine herself requested this emergency summit. It wasn't a tactical discussion about a tour or a budget meeting. It was a confrontation with history. Catherine had emerged from a closed-door session looking like she had seen something she could never unsee. In her hands, she clutched a collection of documents tied not to the administrative future of the monarchy, but to the haunting, unfinished legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales. Within hours, the entire royal household understood one terrifying truth. The carefully constructed peace of the last 3 decades was over. What made the air inside the palace so thick with tension was not just the secrecy, but the sudden, radical change in behavior among the inner circle. The gray men, the faceless bureaucrats who run the institution, are famous for their absolute composure under pressure. But that day, that composure was nowhere to be found. Sources familiar with the situation suggest that Catherine had spent months quietly reviewing archived material from the late 1990s. She wasn't looking for jewelry or fashion inspiration. She was hunting for a specific charitable vision that Diana had been developing just weeks before her life was cut short in a Parisian tunnel. It was a vision for a modern monarchy that was far more radical, far more human, and far more dangerous than anything the current institution was prepared to handle. The meeting reportedly involved Prince William, who was described as looking emotionally depleted as he sat through the briefing. This wasn't a political debate for him, it was a reckoning with his mother's ghost. Alongside them were senior legal advisors connected to the Royal Foundation and a handful of long-serving aides who had survived the turbulent Diana years. These were the gatekeepers of the past, the ones who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. And they were terrified. Catherine was not just asking questions, she was presenting a plan. She was suggesting that the very things the palace had suppressed about Diana, her raw empathy, her willingness to touch the untouchable, her refusal to be a silent ornament, were the only things that could save the monarchy in the 21st century. As the meeting stretched into its third hour, the silence outside the room became deafening. Staff were reportedly instructed not to discuss the gathering with any outside contacts, including the press, under any circumstances. In the world of the royals, such a strict order usually signals a catastrophe. But this wasn't a tragedy in the traditional sense. It was a revival. Catherine had allegedly discovered a series of seal legacy arrangements, private initiatives, and handwritten letters from Diana that detailed a blueprint for a monarchy that exists for the people, not just above them. These documents didn't just contain charitable goals. They contained critiques of the existing system that were biting, honest, and incredibly relevant to the current struggles the family faces. For years, the institution has tried to preserve Diana's memory like a museum piece, static, beautiful, and safe. They turned her into a saint so they wouldn't have to deal with her as a revolutionary. But Catherine's discovery suggests that Diana's unfinished business was a ticking time bomb of reform. By bringing these papers into the light, Catherine was essentially telling the king and his advisors that the old way of doing things was no longer an option. Later that same evening, Catherine was spotted near memorial areas associated with Diana. She wasn't there for a photo op. She stayed in complete silence, avoiding the long lenses of the paparazzi, refusing any public interaction. Her expression remained somber, reflective, and determined. She was no longer just the wife of the future king. She was becoming the guardian of a legacy that the palace had spent millions of pounds and 30 years trying to manage. The following morning, the palace communications team abruptly shifted their tone regarding all upcoming engagements related to Diana's past work. The veteran royal correspondents, the ones who can read the subtle movements of the palace like a weather map, knew immediately that the storm had arrived. Rumors began to swirl that a major announcement was being prepared, something bold, something emotionally charged, and something that would potentially redefine the role of the queen consort and the future queen. But as Catherine prepared to challenge the status quo, she was entering a minefield. The traditionalists within the palace walls, the ones who believed that the monarchy's power lies in its mystery and distance, viewed her move as an act of institutional suicide. They feared that by reopening the Diana chapter, Catherine would inadvertently revive the old wars between the supporters of the late princess and the supporters of King Charles and Queen Camilla. They worried that the public would once again compare the two women in a way that would destabilize the fragile popularity the king has worked so hard to build. Catherine understood the risk better than anyone. She knew that every step she took closer to Diana's shadow was a step away from the safety of tradition. She stood in front of the mirrors of Kensington, perhaps glancing at the blue sapphire on her finger, the very ring Diana once wore, and realized that the weight of that stone was far heavier than she had ever imagined. She was about to launch a project that would either save the Windsors or tear them apart from the inside. And as she stepped out to face the world, she was unaware that King Charles had already formulated a response that no one saw coming, a response that could either validate her mission or end her royal influence forever. The response from the king did not come in the form of a shouting match or a formal decree. Instead, it arrived in the quintessential Windsor fashion, a summons to a private dinner at Sandringham, away from the prying eyes and sensitive microphones of London. King Charles III is a man who has spent his entire life in the long, often cold shadow of his own history. He understood better than anyone that what Catherine was holding wasn't just paper, it was a mirror. And for Charles, looking into that mirror meant facing the most painful chapters of his existence. When Catherine arrived, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. The king was reportedly found in his study, surrounded by the architectural drawings and climate reports that define his current reign. But on his desk sat a single, faded photograph of a young William and Harry. The message was clear. He knew this was about family, not just policy. Sources say the conversation began with a heavy silence, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. Charles didn't ask her to stop. He asked her if she truly understood the ghost she was trying to summon. Behind the scenes, however, a different kind of war was being waged. While the king and the princess spoke of legacy, the Grey Men, the senior palace courtiers, were moving into damage control mode. They viewed Catherine's fascination with Diana's unfinished work as a direct threat to the current stability of the reign. To them, Diana represented the War of the Waleses, a period of chaos that nearly toppled the throne. They began a quiet campaign of institutional resistance. Information started to leak to preferred tabloids, questioning Catherine's focus and suggesting that she was becoming obsessed with the past. But the resistance only seemed to fuel Catherine's resolve. Among the documents she had retrieved was a series of correspondences between Diana and various international leaders regarding a project called the Compassion Network. It was a plan to create a global rapid response team for mental health crises and child welfare, something that was decades ahead of its time in 1997. Diana had been told it was too political and unbecoming of a royal. Catherine saw it differently. She saw it as the missing piece of the modern monarchy's soul. As Catherine began to integrate Diana's language into her own public speeches, using words like emotional honesty and the bravery of vulnerability, the public's reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. On social media, the Diana effect began to trend. People weren't just comparing their clothes, they were noticing a shift in the institution's temperature. The monarchy was starting to feel less like a monument and more like a heartbeat. But this surge in popularity created a new, even more delicate problem: the unspoken tension with Queen Camilla. Camilla has spent 20 years meticulously building a reputation for hard work, loyalty, and quiet dignity. She has moved from being the other woman to a respected queen consort. But the revival of the Diana myth threatened to undo all of that. Every time Catherine invoked Diana's memory, she inadvertently reminded the public of the pain that had paved the way for Camilla's current position. The palace corridors became a minefield of diplomatic navigation. Catherine and Camilla remained perfectly professional in public, but insiders described the private meetings as Arctic. Prince William found himself caught in the most difficult position of his life. He was a son who loved his father and respected his stepmother, but he was also a man who had watched his mother be silenced by the very institution he was born to lead. Reports suggest that William had a heated exchange with one of the king's top advisors who suggested that Catherine should scale back her references to the late princess. William's response was reportedly short and definitive: "We are not making her invisible again." The tension reached a breaking point when Catherine decided to visit a youth center in a marginalized area of London, an engagement that mirrored one of Diana's most famous unguarded visits. She went without a massive security detail, without the usual formal barriers. She sat on the floor, she listened, and she leaned into the raw, uncomfortable stories of the people there. The footage went viral, but not for the reasons the palace hoped. A veteran photographer noted that Catherine wasn't just performing a duty, she was following a specific set of instructions found in Diana's private notes on how to see the unseen. This wasn't just a PR stunt, it was a test of power. By using Diana's methods, Catherine was proving that the people's princess hadn't just left behind jewelry, she had left behind a manual for survival. The palace traditionalists were horrified. They argued that by stripping away the mystique of the royal family, Catherine was making them too common. They feared that if the public saw them as human, they would eventually see them as unnecessary. Then, just as the internal debate reached its peak, a new document was discovered. While deep in the archives, a junior researcher acting on Catherine's request found a sealed envelope that had been misfiled for nearly 30 years. It wasn't a policy paper or a charitable plan, it was a personal letter written in Diana's distinctive looping script addressed to the woman who comes after me. The discovery of this letter sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of the household. The existence of such a message was a nightmare for the gatekeepers of the past. What did it say? Was it a warning, a blessing, or a revelation that would compromise the king himself? As the sun set over the gray stone walls of Windsor, Catherine held the unopened envelope in her hands. She knew that once she broke the seal, there would be no turning back. She was no longer just fulfilling a mission. She was about to hear a voice from the grave that the monarchy had tried to silence forever. The seal of the letter was not made of royal wax, but of a simple, brittle adhesive that had survived 3 decades of shifting dust in the bowels of the archives. As Princess Catherine's fingers brushed the paper, she felt a visceral connection to a woman she had never met, yet whose life had become the blueprint for her own. Breaking that seal was an act of quiet defiance. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakably Diana's hurried, emotional, and raw. It didn't start with a formal title. It started with a plea. They will try to make you a mirror. They will ask you to reflect only what they want to see. Please, for the sake of my boys, do not let them. The contents of that letter reportedly transformed Catherine overnight. It wasn't a list of grievances or a tell-all confession. It was a survival guide. Diana had written about the emotional starvation of the institution, the way the palace machinery is designed to consume individual personality and replace it with a polished, hollowed-out icon. For the first time, Catherine wasn't just reading history, she was reading her own future warnings. But as she absorbed these words, the Grey Men at Buckingham Palace were already preparing a counterstrike. They couldn't stop the princess from reading, but they could control the narrative surrounding her. A series of carefully placed leaks began to appear in the high society columns. The whisper campaign was subtle but lethal. They suggested that the pressure of the role was beginning to take a toll on Catherine's mental well-being. They used the same coded language they had once used to discredit Diana in the early 90s. By framing her newfound resolve as instability, the traditionalists hoped to neutralize the threat she posed to their rigid, silent world. But this time, the machinery faced a variable they hadn't accounted for: a united front between the heir and his wife. Prince William, having lived through the weaponization of the press against his mother, recognized the patterns instantly. Insiders say the atmosphere at Adelaide Cottage, the couple's private residence, became a war room. William wasn't just protective, he was furious. He reportedly bypassed the standard communications channels and spoke directly to the king, warning that any attempt to Dianify Catherine's reputation would lead to a total breakdown in family relations. King Charles found himself in an impossible vice. On one side was the institution. He had waited 70 years to lead a system that relies on tradition and the suppression of individual ego. On the other were his son and daughter in law, who held the key to the monarchy's future relevance. Charles, a man often characterized by his own internal conflicts, reportedly spent hours walking the grounds of Highgrove in solitary thought. He knew that the letter Catherine found could either be a bridge to a new era or the torch that burned the whole house down. The tension culminated during a high profile state banquet. This was the ultimate stage, a world of tiaras, sashes, and centuries old protocol. The palace advisors had provided Catherine with a strictly vetted speech, one that focused on traditional diplomatic platitudes. They wanted her to play the part of the silent, beautiful consort. But Catherine, with Diana's letter folded tightly in her evening bag, had other plans. As she stood at the podium, the room fell into an expectant hush. She began with the prepared remarks, but then she stopped. She took a breath that seemed to last an eternity. Deviating from the script, she began to speak about the burden of silence and the necessity of reaching into the dark corners of society. She used phrases that were direct echoes of the Compassion Network documents she had found. She spoke of a monarchy that doesn't just preside over the people, but suffers alongside them. In the back of the room, the senior aides were seen frantically checking their phones. The script had been abandoned, the princess was speaking her own truth. The reaction in the room was a mixture of shock and profound admiration. Prince William watched from his seat, his expression one of quiet, steely pride. Queen Camilla, however, remained impassive, her face a mask of royal decorum that hid a growing realization. The age of the quiet royal was being dismantled in real time. Catherine had successfully bridged the gap between the untouchable and the visceral, just as Diana had once done. But as the banquet ended and the guests departed, the real consequences began to surface. The Grey Men viewed Catherine's speech as an act of open rebellion. They realized that they no longer held the leash. That night, a clandestine meeting was held in a windowless room in the basement of Buckingham Palace. The goal was no longer to guide Catherine, it was to contain her. They began to dig into her past, looking for any flaw, any secret, any shadow that could be used to bring her back in line. What they didn't know was that Catherine had already anticipated their move. Diana's letter had warned her about the file diggers, and as the palace bureaucrats began their search, they stumbled upon something they never expected to find: a secret archive. Catherine had been building herself a digital vault containing every communication, every order, and every attempt to silence her over the past year. As the clock struck midnight, Catherine sat in the dark of her study, realizing that the game of shadows had moved to a new level. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the next discovery would lead her to a hidden room in Althorpe that had remained locked since 1997, a room that held the final, most explosive piece of the Diana puzzle. The journey from London to Althorpe is only 70 miles, but for Princess Catherine, it felt like traveling to a different dimension. To escape the Grey Men and their sophisticated surveillance net, she didn't use the royal motorcade. There were no flashing lights, no outriders, and no official itinerary. She slipped out of Adelaide Cottage in a nondescript SUV, driven by a member of her private security detail who had been with her since the early days, someone whose loyalty was to the woman, not the institution. Behind her, the towers of Windsor faded into the mist, and with them, the rigid expectations of 1,000 years. Althorpe House, the ancestral home of the Spencers, stood like a silent sentinel in the Northamptonshire countryside. It is a place of sanctuary, but also a place of heavy, unprocessed grief. When Catherine arrived, she wasn't met by a line of bowing staff. She was met by Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, a man who has spent decades acting as the fierce guardian of his sister's memory. The relationship between the Spencers and the Windsors has always been a delicate truce, but as Catherine stood on the stone steps, Spencer reportedly saw something in her eyes that changed the dynamic instantly. She wasn't there as a representative of the crown. She was there as a daughter-in-law seeking the truth. According to those close to the Spencer estate, the meeting took place in the Great Library, under the watchful gaze of centuries of ancestors. Catherine laid out the documents she had found at Kensington and the letter she had unsealed. Spencer, moved by the princess's resolve, allegedly led her to a part of the house that remained strictly off limits to tours and even most family guests. It was a small, high-ceilinged room at the end of the West Wing, a room that had been locked shortly after the funeral in 1997 and rarely opened since. It was Diana's private retreat, preserved in a state of haunting, dusty perfection. The air inside the room was cold, smelling of old paper and dried lilies. On the desk sat a simple black leather briefcase, embossed with the initials DSP Diana Spencer. This was the final piece mentioned in the Kensington files. As Catherine opened the briefcase, she found what historians have long whispered about but never confirmed: the Windsor Covenant. It was a set of handwritten conditions Diana had drafted in the final months of her life, a revolutionary framework for how her sons should reign when their time came. This wasn't a bitter manifesto. It was a brilliant strategic blueprint for a social monarchy. Diana had outlined a plan to dismantle the hierarchy of the royal court and replace it with a system of direct accountability to the people. She wrote about the poison of the inner circle and the need for the future king to surround himself not with aristocrats, but with the leaders of social change. But the most explosive part of the document was a section titled the Transparency Act, where Diana detailed specific financial and structural reforms that would strip away the secrecy surrounding the Duchy of Cornwall, the sovereign grant. As Catherine read through the pages, she realized that this was exactly why the Grey Men were so terrified. If these papers ever became public, the institution wouldn't just change, it would be forced to undergo a total reinvention. But as she absorbed the weight of the discovery, her phone began to vibrate incessantly. The palace had realized she was gone. The electronic leash had been triggered. The senior courtiers knew exactly where she was, and they knew what Althorpe represented. The countermove was swift and brutal. While Catherine was still at Althorpe, a story was planted in the Sunday papers, a high-level leak suggesting that the king was considering a major shuffling of royal roles, one that would see Catherine's public profile significantly reduced in favor of a more traditional, background-focused approach. It was a warning shot across the bow. They were telling her that if she continued to dig into the past, they would erase her future. Prince William, however, was no longer playing the game of diplomacy. Reports suggest that he made a frantic late-night call to the king's private secretary, his voice echoing through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. He reportedly told them, "You tried this with her once before. You will not do it again. If you move against Catherine, you move against the king to come." The threat was explicit. The House of Windsor was now officially divided into two camps: the protectors of the secret and the seekers of the light. As the sun began to rise over the Althorpe estate, Catherine sat in the SUV, the black briefcase on the seat beside her. She knew that returning to London meant entering a cage that was now electrified. She had the documents that could break the institution, but she also had the responsibility to save it. She wasn't just a princess anymore, she was a whistleblower within the world's most powerful family. The part that would eventually stun the nation occurred as she re-entered the gates of Windsor. Instead of heading to her private home, she instructed the driver to take her directly to the king's private apartments. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to present the Windsor Covenant to Charles himself. But as she walked through the doors, she found the room already occupied not by the king, but by a phalanx of the senior-most advisors, the very men who had tried to silence Diana. They stood in a semicircle, their faces set in grim masks of authority. The trap had been set, and Catherine was standing directly in the center of it. The silence in the king's private study was different from the silence at Althorpe. In the Spencer Library, the air felt thick with memory and reverence. Here at Windsor, it was sharp, clinical, and heavy with the scent of an impending execution. The five men standing before Princess Catherine represented the old guard, the constitutional lawyers, the private secretaries, and the hereditary advisors who believe the monarch is not a person, but a corporate entity. At the center of the semicircle stood Sir Edward Young's successor, a man whose family had served the crown since the Victorian era. He didn't look at Catherine as a member of the family. He looked at her as a glitch in a very expensive system. The senior courtier stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the black leather briefcase Catherine held against her chest. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he spoke in a tone that was terrifyingly polite, the kind of voice used to tell someone they are being institutionalized for their own good. He told her that her unauthorized excursion to Althorpe had created a security protocol breach of the highest order. He suggested that the documents she had removed from the Spencer estate were technically state property under a forgotten 19th century statute regarding royal correspondences. They weren't asking for the briefcase, they were demanding the surrender of her leverage, but Catherine didn't flinch. She had spent a decade being the perfect student of royal decorum, learning how to be invisible when necessary and radiant when required. But the woman who stood in that room was the woman Diana's letter had called forth. She told them, quite simply, that she was not there to discuss protocol with the staff, she was there to see the king. When the advisors moved to physically block the path to the inner sanctum, the heavy double doors behind Catherine swung open with a violence that startled even the most seasoned courtiers. Prince William entered, not with the stride of a diplomat, but with the focused rage of a commander. He didn't say a word to the advisors. He walked directly to Catherine's side, placed a hand on the small of her back, and looked the lead secretary in the eye. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently it was almost palpable. William told them that the era of the gray men deciding what the family could and could not see was over. He informed them that if they didn't clear the room immediately, he would make the contents of the Spencer briefcase public on his own social media channels within the hour. It was a nuclear threat. For the advisors, public exposure is the equivalent of death. One by one, the masks of authority crumbled, and the phalanx retreated into the shadows of the hallway. When the doors finally closed, leaving William and Catherine alone in the king's study, the tension didn't evaporate, it condensed. King Charles III was standing by the window, looking out over the long walk. He had been there the whole time, a silent witness to the confrontation. He turned slowly, his face etched with a fatigue that went deeper than age. He looked at the briefcase and whispered a single word: finally. It was a confession. Charles admitted that he had spent 30 years trying to forget the Windsor Covenant, but he had also spent 30 years knowing that the institution was suffocating without it. The conversation that followed was the most honest exchange in the history of the modern House of Windsor. Charles revealed that Diana hadn't just written the covenant in secret. She had sent a draft to him weeks before her death, hoping they could find a way to implement it together after their divorce. He had wanted to, but the palace machinery, the very men Catherine had just faced, had convinced him it would be the end of the monarchy. They had used his guilt and his fear to bury his ex-wife's vision. For 3 decades, he had lived with the weight of that cowardice. As the three of them sat around the mahogany table, reviewing the handwritten pages, a plan began to form. This wasn't about a sudden revolution, it was about an evolution of the soul. They decided to merge Catherine's compassion network with the structural reforms of the covenant. It was a way to fulfill Diana's legacy without declaring war on the crown. But the advisors weren't finished. Outside the room, the machinery of the Grey Men was already moving to its secondary phase: total character assassination. By the next morning, a coordinated wave of negative press hit the global news cycle. It wasn't about the documents, it was about Catherine's alleged rift with the king. High-level sources claimed that Catherine was attempting to usurp the queen consort's influence and that William was being manipulated by his wife's ambition. They were trying to turn the public against the very person the public loved most. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy designed to force William and Catherine into a defensive crouch. But the most chilling development occurred when Catherine returned to her private office at Kensington Palace. Her lead security officer informed her that the digital vault she had built, the one containing the records of the palace's interference, had been breached. The encryption hadn't been cracked by a hacker. It had been bypassed using an administrative master key that only 2 people in the country possessed. Catherine realized that she wasn't just fighting a group of advisors. She was fighting a deep state apparatus that had been protecting the crown's secrets since before the Great War. As the sun set over London, Catherine stood on her balcony, looking out at the city that adored her. She knew that the Windsor Covenant was no longer just a set of papers. It was a target on her back. And as she prepared for the most important public appearance of her life, the opening of a major new center for the Royal Foundation, she received an anonymous text message on a phone that shouldn't have been reachable. It was a photograph taken through a long range lens, showing her in the locked room at Althorpe holding the briefcase. The message was simple: History repeats itself, Princess. Be careful where you drive. The text message on Princess Catherine's screen was more than a threat, it was a demonstration of absolute reach. To have a long range photograph of her inside a private Spencer estate meant that the surveillance was not just external, it was integrated. It meant that the very people paid to protect her might be the ones documenting her downfall. Catherine didn't show the message to her staff, she didn't call the police. She walked to the window and looked at the black, unmarked cars parked in the shadows of the palace courtyard. For the first time in her life, she realized that the gilded cage was actually a high tech panopticon. When Prince William saw the message, the diplomat in him died, and the soldier returned. Sources close to the couple say the atmosphere inside Adelaide Cottage turned from a home into a command center. William immediately initiated a clean sweep protocol, replacing their entire personal security detail with former comrades from his search and rescue days, men whose loyalties were forged in the cockpit, not in the court. He understood the subtext of the message. Diana was killed when she tried to step outside the system while holding the keys to its redesign. Now, Catherine was holding those same keys, and the system was beginning to growl. But the Grey Men weren't just using threats, they were using the most powerful weapon in the British arsenal: the perception of reality. Overnight, the narrative shifted from Catherine's charitable work to a sophisticated campaign of gaslighting. Major news outlets began running psychological profiles by unnamed experts, suggesting that the princess's recent behavior was a sign of associative trauma, a condition where a person begins to subconsciously mirror the tragic life of a predecessor. They were telling the world that Catherine wasn't a reformer, she was a woman losing her mind. This was the ultimate move in the palace playbook. If they could make the public believe the princess was unstable, they could delegitimize the Windsor Covenant before a single word was ever officially read. Catherine felt the walls closing in. Every time she spoke, every time she smiled, she knew a dozen sources were waiting to interpret her expressions as symptoms. But as the pressure reached an unbearable level, an unexpected ally emerged from the shadows. Queen Camilla, the woman who had spent decades as the palace's most controversial figure, reportedly requested a private walk with Catherine in the gardens of Highgrove. Away from any listening devices, Camilla did something she has never done. She spoke about the cost of survival. She told Catherine that the institution doesn't just silence its enemies, it eats its own. Camilla revealed that she too had found fragments of Diana's vision years ago, but she had been too afraid to act. She looked at the young princess and whispered, "They think you're the next Diana. Show them you're the first, Catherine." Empowered by this secret endorsement, Catherine decided to accelerate the timeline. She knew that the Windsor Covenant couldn't remain a secret document in a briefcase. It had to become a public reality. She and William began working with a clandestine group of constitutional reformers and tech-savvy activists to create a digital transparency portal, a platform that would fulfill Diana's vision of a monarchy, accountable to its citizens. It was a plan to move the crown's wealth and influence out of the shadows and into a verified public trust. The night before the official opening of her new center, the event where she planned to signal this shift, Catherine went into the palace archives one last time. She wasn't looking for more papers. She was looking for a specific recording, a piece of surveillance audio from the night of Diana's final departure from Kensington Palace. What she found chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just a record of a departure. It was a recording of a phone call between two senior courtiers discussing the necessity of a permanent solution to the Diana problem. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Windsor Covenant wasn't just a plan for reform, it was the motive for a crime that had been hidden for 30 years. Catherine realized that if she released the documents, she wouldn't just be changing the future, she would be solving the most high profile cold case in history. But as she gripped the headphones, the lights in the archive room flickered and died. The heavy security door hissed shut, locking from the outside. In the pitch blackness of the archive, Catherine heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the restricted sub-basement. A voice, cold and distorted through a handheld radio, echoed through the room. You were warned about the archives, Your Royal Highness. Some things are buried because they are still toxic. As the sound of the footsteps drew closer, Catherine realized that the Grey Men were no longer worried about her reputation. They were worried about their freedom. The darkness inside the Kensington archives wasn't just a lack of light, it was a physical weight, pressing against Princess Catherine's chest like the hands of a ghost. In that pitch black silence, the approaching footsteps sounded rhythmic, deliberate, and entirely official. Catherine reached into the pocket of her blazer, her fingers closing around the small digital recorder that now held the most dangerous audio in the history of the House of Windsor. She wasn't thinking like a royal anymore, she was thinking like a target. She crouched behind a heavy shelf of 18th century land deeds, her breath shallow, realizing that if she was found here, she wouldn't just be silenced, she would be disappeared into the institution's long history of accidents. But the system had underestimated one crucial factor: Prince William's transformation. Outside the archive doors, the sophisticated electronic lock suddenly hissed and sparked. The door didn't just open, it was bypassed by a tactical override. A beam of white light cut through the dust, and for a split second, Catherine saw the silhouettes of the men approaching her from the sub-basement. They weren't wearing palace livery, they were in civilian tactical gear, the faceless enforcers of a shadow state. Then, a voice boomed through the hallway, a voice that carried the authority of a future king. It was William, flanked by his new security team. The intruders vanished into the restricted tunnels as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and the cold reality of a failed assassination attempt. When William reached Catherine, he didn't offer a royal embrace. He took her hand, saw the recorder, and looked at his lead security officer, a man who had served with him in the RAF. The unspoken command was clear: the palace was no longer safe. They retreated to a black site within Adelaide Cottage, a room that had been stripped of every wire, every sensor, and every connection to the palace grid. There, in the dim light of a single desk lamp, they played the audio. The voices were clear. They belonged to two men who had been at the heart of the Queen's private office in 1997. They spoke of the Windsor Covenant as a terminal threat to the social order. They spoke of Diana's influence as a virus that needed to be purged. And then the final sentence that broke William: the car is prepared. The light in the tunnel will be the last thing she sees. The realization was a seismic event. The Gray Men weren't just bureaucrats, they were architects of a tragedy. William sat in silence for a long time, his face a mask of stone. He realized that for 27 years he had been shaking the hands of the people who had orchestrated his mother's death. But the rage was quickly replaced by a cold, clinical strategy. He looked at Catherine and realized that the Compassion Network and the Transparency Portal were no longer just reforms, they were a weapon. They decided that the king had to know, not as a monarch, but as a man who had also been deceived for 3 decades. The confrontation with King Charles occurred at dawn at Highgrove. The king was found in his private garden, a place he considers his only true sanctuary. When William played the recording, Charles didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply collapsed into a stone bench, looking as though the very blood had been drained from his veins. He looked at his son and admitted that he had always suspected, but he had allowed himself to be convinced otherwise by the necessity of the crown. He realized that his entire reign had been built on a foundation of blood and silence. In that moment, the king made his choice. He turned to Catherine and gave her a single, trembling nod. Do what she couldn't do, he whispered. Finish it. The morning of the public center opening arrived with a strange, heavy stillness over London. The Grey Men were still in place, acting as though nothing had changed, but their eyes were darting, their movements frantic. They knew the digital vault had been breached, but they didn't know how much Catherine had. They had planned one final, desperate move: an emergency security protocol that would prevent Catherine from taking the stage, citing a credible threat. They were going to physically intercept her before she could reach the microphone. As Catherine's car approached the venue, she saw the phalanx of palace-controlled security waiting at the entrance. Her phone vibrated one last time. It was a message from an encrypted number, likely from the same shadow group that had threatened her. The stage is a trap. If you speak, you will never leave the building. Catherine looked at the thousands of people gathered outside, many of them holding photos of Diana, and then she looked at William. He reached over, took the recorder, and uploaded the file to the transparency portal servers, ready to be triggered by a single command. Catherine stepped out of the car, her head held high, walking directly toward the men who were authorized to stop her. She wasn't just a princess anymore, she was a revolution in a silk dress. The threshold of the stage was more than a strip of polished wood. It was the final barrier between the old world and the new. As Princess Catherine's heels clicked against the pavement toward the entrance, a senior courtier, the man who had replaced the king's own private secretary, stepped into her path. He didn't bow. He stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of bureaucratic ice. He whispered that there had been a structural concern with the stage, and that for Her Royal Highness's safety, the event was being canceled immediately. He gestured for the security team to usher her back toward the black, unmarked car. This was the moment the gray men had practiced for decades, the soft coup disguised as protection. But Catherine didn't stop. She looked directly at the courtier, then slowly turned her head to the left, where a sea of smartphone cameras was already recording every second. She spoke in a voice loud enough for the nearest journalist to hear. If the stage is unsafe for a princess, then it is surely unsafe for the people. Let us move the podium to the street so everyone can hear the truth. The courtier's face twitched. He realized his mistake. He had tried to use a secret protocol in a public space. Catherine walked past him, her own security team forming a human shield that the palace enforcers dared not breach. As she stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere in London shifted from curiosity to a collective breath hold. Millions were watching the live stream. In the back of the room, Prince William sat with a tablet in his hand. His thumb hovered over a single icon, execute. He waited for the signal. Catherine reached the microphone, her eyes scanning the room until they found the men in the shadows, the architects of silence. She didn't open the folder the palace had given her. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple handwritten sheet of paper. Nearly 30 years ago, she began, her voice echoing through the speakers and across the digital world. A vision was drafted in this very city. It was a vision for a monarchy that belongs to the heart, not just the history books. Today, that vision is no longer a secret. At that exact moment, Catherine gave a subtle nod to William. He pushed the button. Simultaneously, across every major news network, on every social media platform, and on the newly live transparency portal, the Windsor Covenant and the suppressed 1,997 audio files were released to the world. The sound that followed was unlike anything the monarchy had ever experienced. It was the sound of a billion notifications. In the audience, people began to gasp, their eyes glued to their screens as they heard the cold voices of the past discussing the permanent solution for Diana. The gray men in the back of the room realized the game was over. Their phones were already blowing up with calls from the Metropolitan Police and constitutional lawyers. The fortress of secrecy had been leveled in a matter of seconds. Catherine continued her speech, her voice gaining strength as the weight of the secret finally lifted. She spoke of the Windsor Covenant as the new foundation of the crown, a promise of absolute financial transparency, the dismantling of the old court system, and a commitment to radical empathy. She was no longer just a member of the family, she was the liquidator of their shadows. As she finished, she looked up at the balcony where a small hidden camera was broadcasting her image to the king. Charles, watching from Highgrove, was seen by his staff for the first time in years with a look of genuine peace on his face. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, 3 senior courtiers were taken in for questioning by specialized units of the London police. The grey men who had ruled from the shadows for generations were being walked out of Buckingham Palace in the light of day. The institution was in shock, but the public was in a state of euphoria. The Diana audio had provided a dark closure, but the Windsor Covenant had provided a bright future. Catherine had done the impossible. She had used the very ghost that haunted the monarchy to give it a soul. A week later, the sun rose over a different kind of London. The palace announced a total restructuring of the royal household, led by the Prince and Princess of Wales. The secret archives were being digitized for public access. The Compassion Network was now the Crown's primary mission. Catherine stood once more in the private gardens of Kensington, the same place she had emerged from weeks ago, looking shaken. But today, she wasn't clutching files. She was holding William's hand. They looked at the statue of Diana, which now seemed less like a memorial and more like a sentinel. The silence was finally gone, replaced by a conversation that would never be silenced again. The era of the perfect royal was dead. The era of the human monarchy had begun. And as Catherine looked into the camera for the final frame of the world's most watched documentary, her smile wasn't just radiant.